For those of you I've not yet had the chance to meet, my name is John Highbush. I'm the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you, and there are a lot of you here this evening. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize some special guests that we have with us this evening. First, our absolutely terrific Congressman, Elton Gougley, and his wife, Janice. Congressman. Our really great friends, Gary Sinise and his wife, Maura. Gary. Austin Buettner, our Deputy Mayor of Los Angeles. Austin. I'd also like to welcome Colonel Mark Tillman. Colonel Tillman, will you stand up? I think I see you out there. There you go. Now, Colonel Tillman was one of President Bush's Air Force One pilots throughout his presidency. His other claim to fame is that he flew this Air Force One on its final flight from Washington, D.C. to the Reagan Library. So for any of you that are interested in how he landed on these three pillars just before he hit the glass, he'd be happy to explain that to you afterwards, okay? Now from our Board of Trustees, President Bush's ambassador to the Court of St. James, Bob Tuttle. Bob. President Reagan's Secretary of Labor, Anne McLaughlin-Korologos, and her husband, Tom, former ambassador to Belgium. Mr. and Mrs. Jim Pattison. Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Parsky. Mr. Brad Freeman. And Mr. Michael Castine. Finally, from our Board of Trustees, our longtime chairman, Mr. Fred Ryan. Fred. Fred, in addition to being the President, Vice Chairman, and Chief Operating Officer of All Britain Communications, is also the President and CEO of the now famous Politico.com, which I believe the President reads religiously. From 1982 to 1989, Fred served in the White House as an assistant to President Reagan. He was one of the youngest people ever appointed by a president to such a senior position. After President Reagan left office, he served as his chief of staff and was a central force behind the design, construction, and operation of this magnificent library. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Fred Ryan.
Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction, and thank all of you for joining us today for this very special occasion. It's a distinct honor for all of us to be able to welcome President Bush back to the Reagan Library. And wasn't it great earlier this week to see President Bush breaking ground on a library of his own? Yeah. I think Dick Cheney described it best in calling it the only real shovel-ready project in America. Today marks President Bush's third visit to the Reagan Library. The first was as governor of Texas, the second as President of the United States here to inaugurate this Air Force One pavilion, and tonight he returns in what Ronald Reagan described as the only position that our Constitution holds in greater regard than president, that of private citizen. In discussing his return to private life, President Bush recently told an audience about what it means to be out of office walking his dog. There he was, I said, former President of the United States, with a plastic bag in my hand, picking up what I had been dodging for 8 solid years. Well, today we're privileged to be able to hear directly from the President about those 8 exciting years, and all of America will be able to read more about those historic times in his just-released book entitled Decision Points. In discussing this book, President Bush said with characteristic humility, "I reflect on what I got right, what I got wrong, and what I'd do differently if I had the chance." Well, my role tonight is to introduce President Bush, and this is the second time I've had the honor of doing it from this platform. Last time, for the dedication of Air Force One, I spent quite a bit of time in advance writing what I thought would be a very thorough and extensive introduction. I talked about his bold leadership in Texas as governor and about his tremendous success in the private sector before that. I wrote about the way he bravely led America and the world following the uncertain days after 9/11. I provided in-depth details about his surprise Thanksgiving visit to Baghdad to visit the troops, and wrote about his tremendous commitment to education in this country through No Child Left Behind. And in that introduction, I also described Laura Bush's many wonderful contributions as First Lady, including her great devotion to reading and to the plight of women around the world. So thinking I'd written the ultimate presidential introduction, I sent it to Karl Rove for his approval, and I hoped his praise. I got it back with 90% of my brilliant prose crossed out. All that was left was the first and last paragraph. And there was a short note from Karl saying, "Remember who the audience has come to hear." And in case I missed the subtlety of that message, she went on to say, "Fred, it's not you." So with that in mind, I have no doubt about who you have come to hear tonight. So I know I speak for everyone here in stating how much we admire the grace, the courage, the firmness of purpose, selfless dedication to the nation's greatest good and highest values that President Bush brought to the White House, and we are all deeply grateful for it. Please join me in welcoming the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Stay up there? I'll come back up. You sure? I'll come back. I'm not up there long, right? Okay. What do you have, 5 minutes? Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Please be seated. Thank you, Fred. Fred, thanks for the kind introduction. I'll talk to Karl. Mrs. Reagan, it's great to be with you. I'm honored to be in your presence. I greatly admire you, and thank you for the invitation to be here at this fantastic tribute to freedom and more importantly, the 40th President of the United States. I thank you all for coming, Fred and John. I appreciate the invitation. I got back from Washington, D.C., and was lying on the couch, and Laura came in, and I said, "Free at last." And she said, "You're now free to do the dishes." I said, "Wait a minute, baby, you're talking to the former President of the United States." She said, "Well, it's your new domestic policy agenda." I do feel free. I love being the President, and I love not being the President. I have been submerged. I have zero desire to be in the limelight except to sell the book. And so I thank you for giving me a chance to come and talk about decision points. I made the decision to write decision points about halfway through my second term. My objective in writing the book is to put you in my position. I made a lot of controversial decisions, and I want to create the environment in which those decisions were made so that our fellow citizens, if they so choose, can get a better sense of what the first 8 years of the 21st century was like and what it was like inside the Oval Office. I also have written this book so that future historians will have a data point. I don't believe there's such a thing as short-term history. I think there needs to be time for the consequences of the decisions that presidents make to be fully understood. The passions of the moment have to pass. People have to have a kind of sober judgment of what took place. And all I want is for this book to become a starting point, or a reference point, not a starting point, a reference point for future historians. I also thought it would be important to describe what it was like to make decisions in a complex environment. The Oval Office and the West Wing of the White House is full of complexity. There's just a lot of issues coming at the president all the time. And hopefully people will get a sense for at least one person's view of how best to make decisions in that type of environment. I don't settle scores. This isn't an angry book because I'm not an angry person. I'm a happy guy. And I tell stories in order to let the reader understand how I was thinking, the emotions I felt, as well as the environment in which I existed. There is a little bit of the book is autobiographical because the first decision is why run for president in the first place. And I thought I'd grab the attention of the reader if I started off this way. Can you tell me a day in which you have not had a drink? And that was my wife, Laura. And if you drank too much, I'm sure nobody here has. I did. If you do, the answer, you'll understand this answer, and the answer is, of course I can. And then I couldn't remember one day in which I hadn't had a drink. And it was the beginning of a story about me quitting drinking. And the truth of the matter is I wouldn't be standing here as the former president had I not quit drinking. And maybe I was signing books in Houston the other day, and a woman walked up and said, you know, my son is in the 30s and has read that story, and he told me he wants to quit. I tell the story not to be a healer, but just to give you a sense for the person making the decision to run for president. I go on from there and talk about my relationship with my dad, my relationship with my mother. As I said in the book, I've got my daddy's eyes and my mother's mouth. I talk about meeting Laura in a guy's backyard, Joe O'Neill's backyard, and falling in love and marrying her 3 months later, and talk about what it was like to be a father. I try to give the reader a sense of my faith, all driving the story to the point where I make the decision to run. And then the big decisions that confronted my administration. And Fred and I are going to talk about those decisions. I appreciate very much the members of my administration who are here. What Fred didn't say was that Tillman was the pilot that flew us into Baghdad. And it's one of the stories in the book. It's one of the more remarkable events of my presidency. Condi was at the ranch. It was right before Thanksgiving. She and I got in the back of a car. The guy said, "Play like you're on a date." I said, "That would be unusual for Central Texas." But we snuck out and got on Air Force One. The people were told it was a maintenance run. We flew to a hangar at Andrews Air Force Base, changed airplanes, and Colonel Tillman was at the helm of the plane that flew us to Baghdad. I'll never forget going up to the cockpit, looking at what appeared to be a serene city, and the marionettes in the background. The sun was setting because Tillman needed to get there just as the sun set. And I described to you the emotions of what it was like to walk into a room full of soldiers who had no clue that their commander-in-chief was there in the midst of a combat zone. I did all I could do to contain my, my high emotion, so I could tell those troops how much the country appreciated their service. Anyway, we got airborne, and Colonel Tillman would tell you the most dangerous part of the mission was not landing but leaving. And so the plane was completely blacked out, and there was a communications blackout. And we got to 10,000 feet, and he gave us the all clear. In other words, we were clear of any surface-to-air missiles. And I called Laura, and I said, "I'm headed home." And she had called the Secret Service and had forgot what time that I would be clear of Baghdad, and she called the agent there at the ranch and said, "Where's George?" And he thought he was talking about my dad. Or he said, "Where's the president?" And she thought I was talking about my dad and mother who were coming over for Thanksgiving. He said, "Well, they're 45 minutes away." And she said, "No, my George." And they said, "Ma'am, we show he's still in the house." Come on up, Fred.
Well, President Bush has kindly agreed to let this be a question and answer session, and I know a number of you have been passing questions up and down the aisle, and I've got quite a stack of them here, and I would like to start asking if that's all right, Mr. President.
Okay.
All right. First question.
How are we going to get rid of the podium?
First question is from Aaron Carrot from here in Simi Valley. Mr. President, if you could say one thing to the men and women currently serving or who have served in the military, what would it be?
I don't miss much about being president. You know, I miss being pampered. I tell the story about the time I just gotten sworn in 2001, and my dad was in the residence, and he's walking down the hall, and two guys emerged from the closet, the presidential closet, and I said, "What do you guys do?" And he said, "We're your valets." And I said to my dad, I said, "I don't really need a valet." And he said, "You'll get used to it." and you know, I miss being pampered. But I really miss being the commander-in-chief. And so what I tell our military folks, past and present, is thank you for your unbelievable sacrifice to our great country.
We have a question that was submitted by Connie McBride of Carlsbad, California. I want to thank you for keeping us safe, Mr. President. I wonder if you still worry about the country staying safe.
I worry about an enemy that is brutal and willing to murder innocent people. One of the chapters in the book is the day of September the 11th. And it's a day that changed my presidency, and it's a day that changed the country. I had gone to a schoolhouse in Florida to listen to a reading program. I was in the process of touting No Child Left Behind. And just before I walked in the school, Karl Rove said a plane has hit the World Trade Center. And just before I walked in the classroom, Condi, who was my national security advisor at the time and in Washington, called and said, "A commercial plane has hit the tower." My reaction was, it was obviously there was an accident of some kind, and I told Dan Bartlett, who was there, to prepare a statement that the federal government would offer any help as necessary. I'm sitting in the classroom listening to the reading program. Andy Card whispers in my ear, "Second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack." I was angry. And then I looked at the child reading, and the innocence of the child compared to the evil of the attackers clarified my job, and that was to use the assets necessary to protect the American people. I saw the I saw the press getting phone calls in the back of the room, and as governor of Texas, I'd been in enough crises to know that if you're the leader of an organization, it's incredibly important to project calm. So I decided not to jump up or startle the kids. I decided to wait for the appropriate moment to leave the classroom. Eventually, I'm in the car heading home, heading to the Air Force One, and Condi calls and says, "A plane has hit the Pentagon." And as I describe in the book, my construct was the first plane was likely an accident, the second plane was an attack, and the third plane was a declaration of war. And that's how I conducted my presidency for 7.5 years.
Thank you, Mr. President.
So to answer the question, yes, there's an enemy there. I made a lot of very difficult decisions to leave tools behind that presidents can use to protect the country, whether it be listening to the enemy or using enhanced interrogation techniques to extract information from these killers. And in the book, I described the decision-making process on all those programs. What most Americans don't realize, even after we lost to Congress, I was able to get all those laws, all those tactics codified into law, so that if future presidents decide to use them, they're available to protect the country.
Mr. President, Juan Alva of Calabasas, California writes, I am a father of 3 daughters. What advice can you give to me to raise them well, given the difficult balance between your work and family?
I would tell, if they're teenagers, I'd say, I love you. There's nothing you can do to make me not love you, so stop trying. You know, look, here's the thing. I was raised by a father who balanced the desire to live a full life with being a good father. There's a lot of kind of psychobabble about my relationship with my father, and that's natural. There was only not many people were president and had a son who's president. And so there's a lot of speculation about that. Look, here's the simple truth. I adore the man. He's an awesome dad. He found the right balance, and he gave me unconditional love. And I tell people running for president is risky. You could run and lose, and they say, what a pathetic candidate. Or you could run and win, and they say, what a pathetic president. Either way, it doesn't matter if you have the unconditional love of somebody you admire. And so my advice to the guy is just love your kids as much as you possibly can and set a good example.
It's advice every one of us can use. Thank you, Mr. President. Jay Levitt of Agoura Hills, California says, thank you for your support of Israel. How come you did not take out Iran's nuclear weapon sites?
I presume that he's referring to the use of military power to take out the sites.
Yes, sir.
The president must use diplomacy as the first means to solve any problem before the use of the military. The most difficult decision of any president is to commit our military into harm's way. And I felt like, unlike Iraq, the Iranian diplomatic situation was just beginning. In other words, we hadn't had enough time to let diplomacy work. I talk in my book extensively about this, or not extensively, some in there about this, about 2 clocks. One clock is the clock of knowledge, that the Iranians it's ticking away for the Iranians to end up with the knowledge necessary to make a bomb. And the other clock is changing the power, who's in power in Iran. And the objective of the United States is to slow down the weapon clock and speed up the change clock. And I felt like the best way to do so was to convince the world to rally around and create a sanction regime that made it more difficult for the powers in Iran to fulfill the promises they made to the people of Iran, thereby speeding up the change clock. And but you might remember, and the book details this, that a lot of my efforts were undermined by a national intelligence estimate that came out in 2007 that said Iran didn't have a nuclear weapons program, which therefore the sanctions began to unravel, or weaken, not unravel, weaken, because people said they don't have a weapons program, why are we sanctioning them? And anyway, that's the answer.
Okay, thank you. Bethany Shackelford, Thousand Oaks, California says, my 8-year-old son wants to know what you wanted to be when you grew up, when you were his age.
Willie Mays. Except I couldn't hit. You know, it's interesting, I really did. I don't know why a guy raised in Midland, Texas would fall in love with Willie Mays. We didn't have TV in those days, or barely had TV. We darn sure didn't have baseball games, but somehow the guy captured my imagination. I think it was for the Sports Illustrated, which was a new publication when I was a little guy. Laura and I used to have T-ball on the south lawn of the White House. I'm a baseball person. I love baseball. I think it's a great game, and I was using my position there to promote the game. And one day they informed me that Willie Mays had agreed to be the commissioner of the day for a T-ball game on the White House lawn, and it was unbelievably exciting to welcome him to the White House and to be with the guy I grew up idolizing.
Janet Jensen from Simi Valley asked, why has it been so difficult to capture bin Laden?
He's not leading any victory parades. And my administration and President Obama's administration is keeping the pressure on him big time. I don't know where he is. If we knew where he was when I was president, I can assure you he'd have been brought to justice. It's the area where some suspect he is very remote. And it's a vast country that is mountainous and difficult to penetrate. And I will tell you this, though, that the Al-Qaeda prior to September 11th and the Al-Qaeda now has been weakened substantially. The only way ultimately to defeat these radicals is to spread freedom as the alternative to their ideology. And I spent a lot of time in my book talking about my belief that freedom is universal, that democracies are transformative. I talk about the relationship I had with Prime Minister Koizumi of Japan. The guy's a good buddy of mine, and to the point where on his last trip to the country, I said, where would you like to go? Is there any place you'd like to go in America? He said, yeah, I want to go to Graceland. So, and at the Rendezvous barbecue joint there in Memphis, Koizumi actually sings Love Me Tender, which is an amazing diplomatic moment. On September the 12th, he calls me and says, Japan and the United States will work side by side to enhance our mutual security and spread freedom as the alternative to those who kill citizens on your soil. It's an amazing conversation. It was ironic for this reason. Some 60 years prior to that, my dad fought the Japanese. 18-year-old kid joins the Navy to fight the Japanese. And now the son is working with the head of the former enemy to enhance our mutual security. And something happened, and I believe it's because Japan adopted a Japanese-style democracy that the enemy became an ally. And I believe, by the way, the same thing's going to happen in the Middle East, that democracy will ultimately prevail, laying the foundation of peace for generations to come.
This question must have come from a historian in the crowd. It says, you share something special with John Quincy Adams. You were both presidents, and you are sons of presidents. What was it like to watch your father be president? Did he give you any tips? And by the way, how are he and your mother doing?
He and mother are fine. Their spirits are good, and he and I spent a unbelievably beautiful moment together that in the at the fourth game of the World Series, when I drove him out in the cart and threw out the pitch. So Dad and I go out there, and it's just a special moment. Moment ruined, however, by the fact that the giant pitcher shut us out. It was a painful experience it was a painful experience to watch my dad be president. When you love a guy as much as I do, and you'd hear the names being called or the mischaracterizations, it really hurt. And so by the time I became president, all the same stuff happening to me didn't matter. It was nothing compared to what it was like to be the son of the president. You know, there's a lot of speculation about the conversations I had with my dad. The truth of the matter is, by far the vast majority were conversations where mother would call and say, your father just read an editorial, probably of an Eastern newspaper. And and he was in the dumps, and so you ought to call your dad. And so I'd pick up the phone and say, Dad, don't worry about it. I'm doing great. You know, don't pay attention to that stuff. I don't. And so he also knew what other presidents knew, that the current president has got a lot more information at his disposal. And and is a lot more aware of what is taking place in the world. And any advice, you know, is helpful, but it doesn't really add that much to the decision-making process. And the truth of the matter is the president, because so much action is taking place, relies on a handful of people who, in my case, I learned to trust.
Next questioner asks, I've read your book, and you spend a large part of your book discussing your foreign policy, specifically related to Iraq and Afghanistan. Talk us through the decision process that led up to the invasion of Iraq and later the surge.
Right. Well, the reason I spent time on that is because I believe these are transformative events necessary to protect the homeland. In Iraq, right after the attack of September the 11th, I described what's called the Bush Doctrine, which is a four-part strategy. One, go on the offense and stay on the offense to protect the country. Secondly, to hold anybody to account that harbors a terrorist. Thirdly, to deal with threats before they fully materialize. And the reason that was a part of the Bush Doctrine is because the attacks of September the 11th made it evident to me and my administration that, you know, we were no longer protected by oceans, that we were vulnerable to attack. And the most vulnerable we could be, it seemed to us and to me, was that an enemy such as Al-Qaeda, if they had weapons of mass destruction, would inflict enormous damage on the country. And finally, the spread of freedom is the fourth pillar in order to finally marginalize the enemy. After 9/11, we viewed threats differently, and Saddam Hussein was a threat. He was an enemy of the United States. He had weapons of mass destruction. He had used weapons of mass destruction. He had invaded a neighbor. He cheered loudly when Al-Qaeda killed people on our soil. And I decided to deal with it in a diplomatic way and describe what I call coercive diplomacy, which is on the one hand you have a diplomatic track, and on the other hand you have a military track enforcing the diplomatic track. And one of the decisions I make in the book was to go to the United Nations to get a Security Council resolution. And there was a hearty debate within my administration as to whether or not we needed to do that. We needed to go to the UN. And I welcome debate, by the way. I like debate, and I like what I call creative tension, when advisors would bring different opinions to the president. And I made the decision to go to the UN, and we got a Security Council resolution passed that said, disarm, or disclose, disarm, or face serious consequences. It was a 15-0 vote. I happen to be one of these guys that when I say something, I mean it, and I meant it when I said we're going to adhere to the Security Council resolution. Almost there. We got another resolution from the United States Congress, overwhelmingly passed by both Republican and Democrats, that authorized the president to use whatever means necessary to protect the country from Saddam Hussein. A lot of congressmen and senators are on record for having made that vote. Some of them changed, interestingly enough. I guess that occasionally happens in politics. And so we started dealing with the diplomatic front. And, you know, Saddam Hussein didn't take me or Tony Blair or any of our coalition seriously. He didn't believe there'd be consequences. And he was given an ultimatum. He chose to ignore it. I believe the decision of war was his. And I sit here in good conscience, being able to say to our military families, I tried to solve the problem peacefully. And history judges you on the actions you take, and no question, you know, there should be a lot of analysis of the liberation, as well as the immediate aftermath of the liberation and the surge. But history oftentimes doesn't analyze what would happen if you didn't make a decision. And I believe that if Saddam Hussein were in power today, even though he didn't have the weapons of mass destruction a lot of people thought he had, there's no question he had the knowledge and the know-how and would have had the money. And I believe it's likely we'd be seeing a nuclear arms race between Iran and Iraq, which would destabilize the Middle East in a big way. I believe a lot of nations in the Middle East that are our allies and friends would be very nervous by an aggressive Saddam Hussein. There is a question as to whether or not he'd be using surrogate extremist force, although they may not agree ideologically, but the surrogate extremist force, like Iran uses Hezbollah to do his bidding. And my conclusion is this: the world is a lot better off without Saddam Hussein in power. And I can assure you 25 million Iraqis are better off with the chance to have their own free government.
Mr. President, this must have come from a member of the White House press corps, because it says, and I'd like to follow up.
Yeah.
The follow-up is, can we win in Afghanistan?
Can democracy prevail in Afghanistan is the question. We won by taking out the Taliban as the first step. I want to remind people that the Taliban harbored al-Qaeda. They provided safe haven for people to train, plot, and then eventually kill. I want to remind people, one of the things Laura and I are doing in the post-presidency is, even though I'm not involved in politics, thankfully, I am involved with policy, and one of the policy areas that we're focused on is the spread of freedom, particularly when it comes to women. I believe women in many parts of the world will lead the democracy movement. And one of the things that we're concerned about is the United States abandoning the women of Afghanistan to the brutality of some of these thugs that incredibly mistreat them. And the question for the country is does it matter if women are mistreated in Afghanistan? And my answer is loud and clear: it does matter. It should matter to our conscience, and it matters to our national security. And so your question is, can democracy prevail? Yes. It's much harder in Afghanistan than in other parts of the world, because Afghanistan is a broke country. It's just really poor. But remember, these are the people that voted a constitution in. They've elected leaders. There's a lot of problems there. But one thing is for certain: if we leave Afghanistan and just kind of say, who cares what happens, democracy won't prevail. And I believe, as I told you earlier, democracies yield the peace we want, or lay the foundation for peace. And and also happen to believe freedom is universal. One of the principles that guided me as the president is the universality of freedom. I believe everybody wants to be free. I don't think you have to be a kind of a white Methodist to want to be free. I believe Muslim women want to be free. I believe Muslim men want to be free. And I think freedom is necessary for peace.
President, one thing I found fascinating in your book was your discussion of your relationship with Vladimir Putin. And there's a question here that specifically says, please tell us about your relationship and why it changed from the beginning of your term to the end.
Yeah. I'll give you a couple of anecdotes. The first time I met Putin was in Slovenia. And I don't remember ever getting that on a geography test, by the way. It's a beautiful country on the backside of the Alps, and we were there, and I decided to meet with him alone, and first conversation was about Soviet-era debt saddling the Russian Federation. After about 5 minutes of his president, and alone is me, Condi, Putin's equivalent of Condi, and 2 interpreters. And in the meantime, the large delegation were like, I don't know what they were doing, probably milling around. Anyway, so about 5 minutes into his presentation on Soviet-era debt saddling the Russian Federation, I said, is it true your mother gave you a cross that she had blessed in Jerusalem? And Putin was startled, needless to say. I didn't tell him where I got the information. I got it from the CIA dossier. And I was interested. I was interested to find out the nature of the man, because I was about to tell him the United States was giving 6-month notice to leave the ABM treaty. And so in order to make that kind of stark declaration, I needed to have a better sense for the person. And I asked him, and he started to talk about his mom and the cross that was in fact blessed at Jerusalem. He tells a story about the cross being hung in a dacha, and he's told the workman, go find the cross, and he describes the hand as the cross, and as I opened, and there was the cross. His countenance changed, and it was a much more relaxed atmosphere. And I was asked later, do you trust Putin? I I didn't want to plagiarize President Reagan. He gave one of the great responses, trust but verify, and I wasn't quick enough to think of anything clever that didn't sound like plagiarism. So I said, yeah. And they said, why? There was a follow-up, why? And I said, and I thought about the story of the cross, and I thought about his countenance changing, and I thought about his demeanor, and the need and the desire to get the gift that his mom had given him back. And I said, because I looked in his eyes and I saw his soul. That's why I said what I said. Our relationship changed over time. Vladimir they started consolidating power, and so I was generally the surrogate for people that were concerned about Russia's drift toward economic hegemony, for example, the use of natural gas to consolidate power. A lot of the Eastern European countries were concerned. The Baltic countries were certainly concerned. And being the President of the United States, people would expect me to talk to Putin. And we're now in Slovakia. And I generally didn't criticize leaders in public. I didn't like it when I'd been criticized by these leaders. And so I was, would kind of hold my fire till I was in private. But I had said prior to the meeting that I was disappointed in some of the decisions that Vladimir Putin had made, particularly with the press. And in our private meeting, he said, what do you object to? I said, well, I really object to you closing down independent media. He said, you do the same thing. I said, what are you talking about? He said, you fired the famous newsman. And it kind of took me aback. I wasn't sure he was talking to, and then it dawned on me. He was talking about Dan Rather. And I said, surely you're not talking about Dan Rather. And he said, yeah. I said, well, Vladimir, whatever you do, don't say that publicly, because the American people will think you really don't understand our system, since Dan Rather didn't work for the government. He worked for a private newscast organization. You remember, this is all about when he forged the documents, or he didn't forge them. He used forged documents to try to affect the election, my re-election. And anyway, so I said, Vladimir, don't talk about that. We get to the press conference. The question from the Russian reporter was, Mr. Putin, President Putin, did you bring up the fact that President Bush fired the famous newsman? Final Putin story. I'm trying to entice you to buy the book. Anyway, so I introduced Putin to Barney. I don't know if you remember Barney. Awesome little dude. And this is at Camp David, and he kind of, wasn't too impressed. And so about a year later, I'm at his dacha. And he said, would you like to meet my dog? And I said, yeah, I'd love to meet your dog. Outbound's Coney. Huge Russian lab, and he looks at me and says, bigger, stronger, and faster than Barney.
Mr. President, while you're talking about world leaders, could you tell a little bit about the relationship with Tony Blair?
Strong relationship. This may come as a shock to you. Occasionally, politicians will look you in the eye and say one thing and mean another. Blair looked in the eye and meant what he said, which was comforting, particularly if you're saddled with the responsibility of being a wartime commander-in-chief. You've got to be able to rely upon your allies. And Tony Blair was no better ally. He's a stand-up guy, and I'm proud to call him friend.
I think we have time for two more questions, if that's all right, Mr. President. First, Nancy Wolford from Camarillo. Is there anything you would change about your time as president?
Well, I would have done some things differently, that's for certain. I would have recognized that a mission accomplished banner sent an unfortunate signal. The banner, of course, was put up on the aircraft carrier to say thanks to the troops that had been on this extensive mission. The problem is we just didn't think through the ramifications beyond the ship. I wouldn't have flown over New Orleans and had my picture taken looking out a window, thereby conveying a sense I didn't care when I cared deeply. As a matter of fact, I probably, look, when the president shows up, all kinds of resources are drained away from the moment. And And I was hesitant to go near the disaster site for fear of first responders being taken off their mission and being criticized for, lessening the response. On the other hand, in retrospect, I should have done a quick touchdown in Baton Rouge, met with the governor, and expressed our concerns for the country, and then flown back to Washington. Laura reminds me that I probably should have been a little more circumspect about my language, like dead or alive. Now, as I said to Laura, at least my friends understood what I was talking about, but it did convey a yeah, but if you're trying to maintain a coalition, I probably could have used better language. And so there's things I probably should have run the immigration reform before Social Security reform. There's a lot of tactical decisions. On the big decisions, whether cutting taxes or liberating countries to protect the country or putting tactics in place to protect America, I wouldn't change those.
The final question we have from Billy Martin Camarillo says, I believe your greatest contribution to God, family, and country is still ahead of you. So what are your plans for the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, that's kind. First of all, I hope I agree with him. I hope he's right that your life doesn't end when you're not the president. As a matter of fact, in many ways, it's a new chapter. I never wanted to be president. Never thought I was going to be president to begin with, by the way. I mean, I wasn't one of these guys that said, if I can only become the 8th grade class president, I'll parlay that to the, eventually kind of claw my way up. And if I had wanted to be president, I'd have behaved a lot better when I was early. And so for me, these 14 years in public life, 6 as governor of Texas, 8 as president, is a chapter. And so the fundamental question is, what's the next chapter? And I'm not kidding you, and it's just my call here, and I'm not making judgment on other people, but I don't think it's good. I just don't want to be out there opining on every subject. And inevitably, you end up being, whatever you say ends up criticizing your successor. I just don't think it is good for the presidency. And so therefore, I'm not going to be, I'll be observant of the political process. I'm fascinated by politics, obviously. I was immersed in it. But I do intend to use my position as a former president to advance some causes, one of which I've just described to you, and that is the advancement of women, particularly in the Middle East, as a way to advance democracy. And we've done something really interesting at our presidential facility, Ms. Reagan. We've got an archive parallel to the archive that all former presidents were required to put in place. And this is an archive for dissidents, underground preachers, political prisoners, to store their diaries, their writings, their musings, their blogs, whatever it may be, in order to encourage them to continue to take the courageous steps necessary to undermine tyrants. We're going to focus on accountability in public schools, with a particular emphasis initially on recruiting and training principals. What's interesting about a principal is parents expect their school to do well, but the principals, and therefore the principal has a responsibility but doesn't have the authority. A principal can't remove a bad teacher. A principal doesn't have much say in a budget, and yet the principal is held to account. And so we're going to work on how better to improve recruitment and training of principals, and how better to empower principals. I'm going to continue working on the idea of helping AIDS victims and dealing with illness in the developing world, because I believe in the admonition, to whom much is given, much is required. I believe it's important individually and collectively. And there's a better way to spend public and private money. And one of the fellows at this Bush Center that we're building is a person that ran PEPFAR, which is arguably one of the greatest foreign aid programs, thanks to the generosity of the American people. As a matter of fact, and it's measurable. It's not just, we don't measure in terms of money spent. We measure in terms of lives saved. Millions of lives have been saved from the scourge of HIV/AIDS, thanks to the American people. And finally, I'm glad you asked. And finally, I'm going to defend the marketplace. And the last chapter of the book. Are we doing all right in time? Doing all right in time?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, last chapter in the book describes a person who believes that the marketplace should function interceding into the marketplace. I was sitting across the table in the Roosevelt room from Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke. I'd gotten to know both men well. I admired both men and trusted both men. If you're the leader of an organization and you surround yourself with people you don't trust, you're not a good leader. I mean, if people are giving you advice and you really don't want their advice, like their advice, or trust their advice, there's something wrong with you as a leader. I trusted the advice of the hard-charging Hank Paulson, former CEO of Goldman Sachs, and the mild-mannered Ben Bernanke, former professor who had written an exhaustive study on the Great Depression. Bernanke says to me, Mr. President, it's likely you'll be overseeing a depression greater than the Great Depression. That's what presidents are confronted with. Stark reality. This wasn't a theoretical debate. You know, this was the moment he said, hey, buddy, the markets are melting down. They're wrong metaphor. The markets are frozen solid. All indications are is that times are going to be really, really bad. And what do you do? Well, I said, what are the options? And before you decide, you got to find out what the options are, and the options were going all in with your money. And I said, let's go for it. Because I didn't want to be a president overseeing a depression. It's one thing for people to be debating on the sidelines. But if you're the guy, you know, and all of a sudden it's your decision as to whether or not we go into a depression, to me it boiled down to I was more worried about people out there working. I understood what depression meant, or I thought I did. And so I painfully used your money to give to the many of the companies that created the house of cards in the first place. And I'll walk you through the decision. I understand TARP is a four-letter word. More ways than one. I believe that decision saved the country from a depression. And I would do it again if I were confronted with the same circumstances.
Mr. President, thank you for your very candid thoughts tonight and for the tremendous insights you provided in decision points.
Let me end with two stories, and then we'll go home. You can buy the book. And hopefully read it. I hope you like it. I really enjoyed writing this book. It was fun. And I wasn't sure whether I'd like writing it, but I did. And I hope you laugh, and I hope you tear up, and I hope you learn. And two stories that are in the book that I hope you find interesting. One, I was giving a speech in Bucharest, Romania. Romania had just been admitted to NATO. And a couple of 100,000 people were there in the town square to hear the president say, an attack on one is an attack on all. I mean, there's nothing like the United States being an ally, particularly for a country that has just come out from underneath the thumb of a brutal dictator. And it was raining that day, and it was kind of dim. It was late in the afternoon, and just as I came up to give the speech, I noticed this lit balcony. And I said, what is that for? And the advanced person said, that is the place where the tyrant Ceausescu had given his last speech, and it was lit as a memorial to freedom. President Iliescu introduces me. I head to the podium. A full rainbow appears. It was a startling moment. And I ad-libbed, God is smiling on us, because the rainbow ended exactly behind the balcony where the tyrant had given his last speech. And the final story I want to share with you is one from Rwanda. Laura and I are there to see this it's called PEPFAR, which is the AIDS initiative. This happens to be a program run by a faith-based organization. I happen to believe that it's important to encourage faith-based organizations with certain restrictions, like no proselytizing when they use public money, to help deliver compassionate help. And in this case, a key ingredient to the PEPFAR program was organizations of faith, all faiths, that wanted to help deal with human suffering. And 50 kids are watching this particular faith-based program being enacted. As a matter of fact, they were teaching young girls how to thwart the advances of predatory older men. AIDS gets spread when old men prey upon young girls who don't know how to say no and aren't sure what to expect. 50 kids are standing there. I'm told that many of these kids had lost their parents to HIV/AIDS. I don't know what moved me, but I said, God is good, and in unison, they said all the time. It was a startling moment. I tried it again. God is good all the time. And when I got back to the United States, I called our team together. I said, I want to share this story with you. I said, if 50 kids who you'd expect would say there is no God, or how can you possibly say God is good? I lost my parents. I'm miserable, can say all the time. Those of us who live in the most blessed nation ever, if we ever hear somebody say God is good, we ought to say at the top of our lungs, all the time. Thanks for coming.